David Carter was not someone who easily showed his emotions. As a longtime family judge, he had dealt with many divorce cases, child custody battles, and broken lives. His work demanded absolute clarity and the ability to analyze situations objectively. Despite the many ups and downs his heart had endured, David always stood firm in his role. However, no one knew that behind his cold exterior and professional success was a man who suffered from a lost love. When he was younger, David had loved a woman named Tasha Williams. Tasha was a passionate and energetic black woman, the complete opposite of David's stern demeanor. In the early days of their relationship, Tasha was like a blazing fire in David's otherwise quiet life. Their evenings together, walking hand in hand under the streetlights, were filled with Tasha's laughter and the stories she shared about her life. She made David feel like a different person, free from the constraints of society's rules. But their love couldn't last. David's family, who had grown up in a society full of prejudice, could not accept Tasha. They looked at her with disdain and blamed her for the racial differences between them. In their eyes, this relationship was unacceptable, a stain on the so-called bloodline of their family. During family gatherings, David could feel the suspicion in their gazes, the whispered comments about how unsuitable Tasha was for him. David, a man who had always valued his family, could not stand up to this criticism. His relationship with Tasha slowly became strained. He found himself torn between two choices. One was true love, and the other was his family, where he found safety and acceptance. In the end, one tear-filled night, Tasha decided to leave. She didn't want to be a burden to David, nor did she want him to choose between her and his family. In the days that followed, David almost lost himself. He immersed himself in work, trying to forget the images of Tasha and the beautiful memories of their time together. But it wasn't easy. Every time he walked down a street, he would see Tasha's figure in the crowd, hear her laughter echoing in the stillness. The old photos of them, the love letters she had written to him when they were still together, had become evidence of a love that had died, memories that David could never erase. David's life slowly returned to its old routine, with work taking up all his time. The divorce trials he participated in no longer stirred strong emotions. He became a tough judge, one who never allowed personal feelings to affect his decisions. But it was hard to hide the loneliness inside. On lonely nights, when there was no work to distract him, David felt the emptiness in his large house. That feeling never disappeared. He had simply learned to live with it. He never married again. Work, legal cases, and his career were all that remained in David's life. But in the quietest moments of the night, when he looked in the mirror and saw himself, David felt a deep emptiness. He could never forget Tasha. She was the only one he had truly loved, the only one who made him feel like he was truly alive and not just existing. And so, the years went by, but the pain in David's heart never faded. It wasn't the pain of regret, but the pain of a lost love, of things that could not be changed. Tasha was gone, but that love remained etched in David's heart, like a scar that would never heal. In the world of lawsuits and work, David continued his career. But sometimes, on quiet late nights, when there was no typing or arguments in the courtroom, he would sit quietly and look back, remembering the woman who had once made his heart beat faster. The girl in his memories, Tasha, a woman he could not protect, a woman he could not keep. On a crisp autumn morning, when the first rays of sunlight were still not strong enough to warm the soul, Judge David Carter's courtroom was filled with the usual bustle and tension. For David, this had become part of his life, a fixed rhythm in his day, where the stories of broken families were recounted and the daily tragedies unfolded under the spotlight of justice. The room, though full of people, held a chilling silence. Not the calm silence of peace, but the kind that conveyed things unsaid, pain that had never been eased. As usual, David sat in his position, eyes focused on case files, his mind still lingering on thoughts of days long past. His heart had grown accustomed to making difficult decisions, but it had never been easy to confront personal emotions. Those emotions had been pushed aside, leaving only the cold block of justice he had sworn to uphold. However, today something unusual awaited him. When the name was called, David lifted his head. The case of Kira Johnson, the secretary announced in a soft but firm voice. Typically, cases involving child custody or family matters didn't catch David's attention, but the name Kira Johnson made him pause. Not because of the details in the file, but because of the strange feeling he sensed when the name was spoken. His eyes instinctively glanced toward the area where the involved parties were seated, and immediately his gaze met another, one that made his heart tighten. Kira entered the courtroom, small but full of strength. With her slender figure, her tight black curly hair tied into a ponytail, her eyes did not avoid contact, but neither did they reveal much emotion. She sat down beside her guardian, her gaze seemingly indifferent yet sharp, as if she had grown accustomed to the scrutinizing looks in the courtroom, as though she had lived her whole life behind the cold walls of emotional neglect. David stared at the girl for a moment, and a strange feeling arose in his heart. Kira's eyes, though sharp and mature for her age, made him feel an unexplainable sense of familiarity. It was those very eyes, that gaze, unyielding yet filled with an unspoken sadness. They were identical to Tasha's eyes. The realization hit David hard, a feeling he thought he would never have to face again. He tried to focus on his work, but the distraction grew stronger. Kira's file lay on the table, but the details within it seemed to blur in his mind, overshadowed by the presence of the girl. Tasha, the woman he had once loved, the woman he could not protect, the one he could never have a future with, was revived in his thoughts. The memories of Tasha, the years they spent together, their smiles, and promises that once seemed eternal, all came flooding back vividly. But this wasn't Tasha, it was Kira, and the striking resemblance between the girl and her mother stirred a fear in David that he had never felt before. Every word from Kira's guardian seemed to echo from a distant place. Kira had been passed through a string of foster families, moved from one place to another, always feeling abandoned and deprived of affection. The guardians who took her and saw her as a responsibility, not as a person, and that's why she seemed so cold, so unwilling to connect with anyone. But when Kira stood up and spoke for herself, without waiting for permission from the judge or anyone else in the room, her voice rang out like a powerful wave crashing against the solid walls in David's mind. I know everyone looks at me and thinks I'm just a child who needs saving, but I don't need pity. I just want a chance to be heard and understood. Her words didn't come from an innocent child. They were strong and certain, as if the girl had lived a long life, not just 12 years on this earth. David could not help but notice the maturity in her voice, the assertiveness that a child shouldn't have. It was a form of resistance, a challenge not only to him, but to everyone around her. David's emotions became tangled. He looked at Kira and felt something very familiar, as though he were seeing a part of himself there, a part he had lost, a part he had buried along with Tasha. But now, it was standing before him, in the form of an abandoned girl, determined and strong, but also bearing deep wounds. The rest of the trial passed in a blur for David. The guardian's words about Kira being shuffled between foster families and the losses she had suffered seemed like distant echoes of a past he didn't want to remember. When it was Kira's turn to speak, she didn't need an invitation, nor any advice from anyone else. She stood up, and in her voice, A strange sense of independence and determination radiated. She wasn't afraid or hesitant when she said, "I've heard enough pity stories about me. Give me a chance to say what I want. I don't need anyone to save me. I just want to be loved like any other child." Everyone fell silent. Facing this girl, David felt a stirring within him, a feeling he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. He wasn't just the judge in his courtroom anymore. He was now standing before an unanswered question, an unsolved mystery. Could it be that a child who had endured so much could be the link that connected David to the memories of a love that had long been lost? Could it be that the love he thought was gone could be revived through a child he had never known? David knew that this meeting was not just another case. It might be the beginning of a new journey, one that he couldn't predict. But one thing was certain: Kira Johnson, this resilient girl, would change David's life forever. The entire week passed, and David could not shake the images of Kira Johnson from his mind. The girl was unlike any other child he had encountered in the courtroom. Every time he looked at her, he felt an indescribable sensation rising in his chest, as though a long-forgotten part of his past was returning, pulling him into a silent conversation he couldn't ignore. That look, the strength mixed with something deeply painful, was identical to Tasha's, the woman he had once loved. Tasha was no longer in his life, but her image lived on in his heart, like a scar that could never be erased. David hadn't been able to sleep well in recent nights. When the night fell and the room became quiet, without the sounds of keyboard taps or footsteps from his secretary, David sat alone with a pile of case files before him. They said a judge shouldn't let emotions interfere with their work, but David was human, and even he wasn't sure whether he could maintain his composure after meeting Kira. Could this girl truly be his daughter? These thoughts were not simply idle questions. They were a compulsion, pieces starting to fall into place in his mind, from a hazy memory to an increasingly clear realization. David had noticed the name Tom in Kira's case file, and when he heard the girl mention in the courtroom that her mother had talked about a man named Tom, a strange feeling overwhelmed him. Tasha, the woman he loved more than himself, the one he had never shared his deepest secrets with, had mentioned a man named Tom. David was Tom. Suddenly, everything became clear, and it was overwhelming. Tasha might have carried a secret that even David hadn't known. That night, David couldn't sleep. The name Kira Johnson echoed in his mind like an unanswered question. The strange similarity between the girl's eyes and Tasha's wasn't a coincidence. The feeling grew stronger as David looked at Kira's face. There was something very familiar. It was the same resilience in her eyes, just like Tasha when she was young, when their love was fresh, before society and family had interfered. David knew what he had to do, but he couldn't pull himself out of the emotional whirlwind. The truth had arrived, but David was afraid to face it. He had lived with the pain of the past and the shadow of Tasha for so long, and now, realizing that he might be Kira's father, he couldn't help but feel as if he were standing at a crossroads with no way to turn back. Over the years, he had managed to keep living without confronting the old memories, but now, he could no longer avoid a truth that had been laid out so clearly. When he decided to take a paternity test, David knew he had no other choice. This wasn't just a case or a professional challenge anymore. This was the life of a child and his own life. Even though he didn't want to face it, he understood that he had to know the truth. And whatever the truth was, he knew he couldn't change it. The next day, David received the test results from a professional lab. He sat in his office, staring at the blank sheet of paper, but his mind was still overwhelmed with unanswered questions. Finally, his hands trembled as he opened the envelope. The words on the paper surged in his mind like a wave. The test results: Kira was David's daughter. The feeling wasn't like anything he had imagined. There was no joy, no pride, only confusion and fear. He couldn't believe what he had just read. A part of him confirmed it was true, but another part couldn't accept it. Could this be a coincidence? Could he truly be a good father when his life had long been centered around work and courtrooms, not a family? David looked at the picture of Kira he had received from the lab, and thoughts of Tasha flooded back. He remembered the evenings they spent together, the things Tasha had shared about a child, about a life without him by her side. Everything started to fade, but one thing was clearer than ever. If Tasha was Kira's mother, then Kira was his daughter. And that could not be denied. The connection between David and Kira was now more than a legal question. It was a family relationship he had never known. But did he have the strength to be Kira's father? Would she want to accept him as her father after all the trauma she had endured? That was a question David didn't have an answer to, and perhaps he wouldn't have it immediately. But one thing was undeniable. His life and Kira's had changed forever. Since that moment, David couldn't return to his previous life. He couldn't stop thinking about Kira, couldn't stop thinking about the future he could create for her. And above all, he couldn't forget the truth he had just discovered. He was that girl's father, a truth that had remained dormant for 12 years. In the days following David's receipt of the paternity test results, his mind felt as though it was being torn in two. Part of him did not want to face the truth. The girl, Kira, was his daughter. It was something he had never imagined, something he didn't know how to accept. David had once thought he could continue living his life alone, with work being everything, but now everything had changed. He had a new responsibility, a child he needed to care for. But how could he start over when his heart had been so weary and full of deep wounds? Kira, with eyes full of challenge and caution, seemed to not trust anything David was trying to show her. She had never had a real family, only foster families who were always ready to abandon her. She didn't need pity. She needed something solid to hold on to. But David, though he knew this relationship couldn't be rushed, tried to do everything he could, because he understood that there was no other choice. He had to try if he didn't want to lose this one chance to be a father. In the early days after the truth was confirmed, David was very careful in his approach to Kira. He didn't want to push her into a relationship she didn't want. Every morning, he woke up earlier than usual, prepared breakfast, and left a small note by the table for Kira. Simple greetings, questions about her new day, small gestures to show he wanted to be part of her life, but without making her feel pressured. Kira still ate quietly, rarely responding, but sometimes her eyes revealed something, a softness, a hint of hope she couldn't hide. David didn't rush. He knew that trust couldn't be built overnight. It was something he had learned from many years of working with divorce cases, custody battles. Abandoned, hurt children didn't easily trust anyone. And Kira, despite her strength and resilience, was still a child with deep wounds inside. What she had gone through, the time she was abandoned, couldn't just disappear overnight. Day after day, David continued with his small gestures. He took Kira to the supermarket, shopping for food. During those times, Kira often stood by herself, silent, but sometimes she looked at him with a scrutinizing gaze. One time, when they were at the bakery, Kira hesitantly said, "Can I pick this one?" David didn't answer immediately. He simply nodded and said, "Pick whatever you like." It was a simple answer, but also a confirmation of the respect and understanding he wanted to show her. She didn't say anything more, but in Kira's eyes, David saw something different. Something was beginning to change. In the evening, when they sat down for dinner, David tried to engage in normal conversations, simple questions about Kira's day, school, her interests. Kira usually stayed silent, nodding or giving short answers, but David didn't give up. He understood that each time she answered, no matter how briefly. It was a small step forward. He didn't need her to open up right away. He just needed her to feel that he was always there, ready to listen, ready to share. Then one day, when David was cooking in the kitchen, Kira entered and stood watching him for a long while, her eyes full of questions. David noticed, and without turning around, he gently asked, "Do you want to help me?" It was the first time Kira had asked about helping him, and also the first time she truly wanted to participate in the small activities at home. Together, they made soup. Kira chopped vegetables, and when they sat down to eat, she looked at the bowl of soup and suddenly said, "My mom used to make this." The words were a soft whisper, but they made David's heart tighten. He didn't say anything, just quietly placed his hand on Kira's shoulder and responded, "We'll make it together like a family." And so, day by day, these simple gestures slowly built a fragile trust. David didn't rush for Kira to call him dad, but every time she addressed him by name, in her eyes, David saw a hint of openness, a glimmer of trust. Perhaps Kira wasn't ready to accept him as her father, but he understood that trust couldn't be forced. It could only come from small, sincere actions that never changed. One afternoon, while they were sitting on the porch, Kira suddenly turned to ask, "Why are you helping me? Why haven't you left me like everyone else?" David looked into her bright eyes, feeling an indescribable unease. He sighed and replied, "Because I can't abandon you, Kira. No matter what, you deserve to have a real family." It wasn't the perfect answer, but for Kira, it was the only affirmation she needed to hear. As time passed, David and Kira's relationship gradually developed. Kira no longer kept the cold walls around herself. Even though there were still times when she doubted and tried to withdraw, the small steps each day made David feel he was doing the right thing. He knew that this relationship would never be perfect, but what mattered was that they were trying and not giving up. Finally, on a beautiful day, while they were sitting together reading in the living room, Kira suddenly asked, "Do you think I could be an architect?" That question was a significant milestone in David's heart. It wasn't just an ordinary question, but a sign that the girl had started to dream about the future, dared to believe in a different life, one where she could have a career, dreams, and a father beside her to support her. David smiled, gently patting her shoulder. "You can do anything you want. I'll always be here to help you." And in Kira's eyes, David saw something bright, a small trust that had been planted in her heart, like a seed beginning to sprout. It was a beginning of trust that both David and Kira had longed for. They both knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least they had begun to walk it together. David Carter had always prided himself on his ability to control his life, keeping everything in order, from his work to the relationships around him. But there was one thing that, no matter how hard he tried, always slipped out of his grasp: Kira. Each day, he realized that the relationship between them was unpredictable. It was a piece of his life that David couldn't control, a piece he had to accept, no matter how painful it sometimes was. In the first few months after the paternity test results were confirmed, David tried to maintain as much calm as possible. He didn't push Kira to accept him as a father or pressure her to open up quickly, because he understood that the girl had been through too much trauma. But gradually, a change began to emerge. Kira became more open, sharing little stories about school, the joys and sorrows of her life. Their relationship, although far from perfect, seemed to be forming a lasting bond. But just as David began to feel that he was doing things right, their lives were thrust into a situation he could never have predicted. One Friday afternoon, after a long day at the courthouse, David received an unexpected call. The voice of the guardian came through the phone, cold but filled with concern. "Mr. Carter, we need you here right away. Kira has run away." The words from the guardian struck David like a bolt of lightning. Every word in that sentence felt like a powerful blow to his rational mind. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. Kira, the girl he had started to build a relationship with, the one he had put all his effort into caring for, had run away. Though David knew their relationship was still fragile, he never expected her to act this way. Immediately, David rushed out of the house, his heart filled with worry. The evening rain had made the roads slippery, and the flashes of lightning in the darkened sky only added to his sense of confusion. Upon arriving, the guardian explained that Kira had left early in the morning, leaving no trace behind, and hadn't told anyone where she was going. Despite searching everywhere, no one knew where she had gone. All they knew was that Kira couldn't stand the feeling of being constrained by rules, and she wanted some time alone to think about what had happened. David felt a vague fear take over. It wasn't just the worry about where Kira was, it was the fear of losing her forever. Over the past few months, he had thought he had grown closer to Kira than ever before, that she had started to trust him, but now the truth was that he couldn't control how she felt, what she was going through. And the greatest pain was not knowing what he had done wrong, not knowing if he was the reason she felt the need to run away. That entire night, David couldn't sleep. He paced the living room, his hand brushing over old photos, familiar objects he had tried to arrange for a family. In his mind, images of Tasha, of the arguments he and she had about parenting, the conflicts in their way of life, kept circling back. David had always wondered if he could have done something better for Kira, if he could have made up for the hardships she had endured. And now, with Kira gone, he felt utterly helpless. The next morning, David received news from the police that they had found Kira. She was in a park outside the city, sitting quietly under an old tree, her head bent and her hands hugging her knees. When David arrived, the sight made his heart clench. Kira didn't say anything when she saw him. She just silently stood up, then turned and walked a few steps away, as if wanting to keep a distance from him. David walked closer, his voice soft, not rushing. Kira, can you tell me why? Kira remained silent for a long while, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Finally, she turned back, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and pain, and said firmly, I don't need anyone to worry about me anymore. I don't want anyone to suffer because of me, and I don't want to be a burden to anyone anymore. David looked at Kira, feeling all the despair in her words. But instead of trying to explain or justify himself, he stood still and let her continue speaking. He knew that the most important thing right now was to listen, to let her feel that she wasn't being forced, but was free to share her feelings. Kira continued, I don't know what I'm doing, but I can't stay here anymore. I don't want to live in a family where I feel like I'm just an extra. I want to be free. Those words made David pause and reflect. He couldn't deny that during their time living together, despite his best efforts, there was still a sense of loneliness in her, a feeling that she couldn't find anywhere she truly belonged. David couldn't blame her, because he understood that her past had made her stronger than most. Kira had learned to protect herself, learned not to trust anyone, not even him. And this made him feel that despite trying his best, he still hadn't been able to truly help her heal the deep wounds in her heart. Finally, David stepped closer to the girl, said nothing, and gently placed his hand on Kira's shoulder. He didn't demand anything from her, didn't expect anything, just wanted her to know that he would never abandon her. Whether Kira wanted to run away or not, he would always be there to listen, to wait, and to help her when she needed. That scene, in the desolate park beneath the fallen trees, was a moment David would never forget. It wasn't a warm reunion or a happy ending, but it was the beginning of a long, challenging journey where both had to face things that couldn't be changed, wounds that time couldn't heal immediately. But at least at that moment, they both knew they wouldn't give up. The rain fell gently on the old graves in the cemetery, creating an atmosphere of quiet stillness that was suffocating. The sky was overcast, as though it, too, understood the heaviness in David Carter's heart. He stood beside the car, hands gripping the steering wheel, his gaze distant as he looked toward the cemetery at the end of the road. Kira sat next to him, silent, not saying a word. Both of them felt the weight of the moment as they prepared to step into a place that buried the past, where memories that could never be changed lay. David didn't speak as he got out of the car, simply walking slowly toward the cemetery. Kira followed him, her small steps firm, as though she had made up her mind to face whatever lay ahead. David couldn't fully understand what Kira was feeling, but he could see the resilience in every movement she made, much like Tasha, the woman he had loved and lost in his life. They passed by carefully maintained graves, some weathered over time, and gravestones shattered by the years. David stopped in front of a modest grave, no flowers around it, just a plain white stone with the name Tasha Williams engraved. It didn't stand out like the other graves, with no fresh wreaths or lit candles. The stone was simply part of this world, a part of the life David had lost. Memories of her, of a love he once thought was eternal, now only lived in the jagged letters etched on the stone. Kira stood quietly beside him, her gaze fixed on the gravestone without a word. She didn't ask anything, nor did she need an explanation. Kira knew that there were things that couldn't be put into words, feelings too complex to express. David stood there, unsure of how long, as though he were searching for himself amid the years that had passed, amid the loss and the pain that had never faded. After a long silence, David finally spoke. "Tasha was your mother, Kira." His voice was deep, filled with emotion that he couldn't hide. Kira looked up at him, her gaze not one of anger or doubt, but of searching for the truth. "Your mother was very special. She did everything she could to take care of you, but she wasn't lucky. We all make mistakes in this life, but that doesn't mean we can't love each other." David's words were a whisper, an acknowledgement, and an apology, not just for Kira, but for himself, because he hadn't been able to protect Tasha, because he hadn't been able to build a future with her. Kira didn't respond immediately. She stood there, silent, her wide eyes staring at the ground in front of her, as if trying to fully understand everything David had just said. The rain began to fall heavier, making the atmosphere even more oppressive. Kira stepped forward, bent down, and gently placed a bouquet of white roses on Tasha's grave. David watched her, feeling an indescribable pain in his heart. A part of him, though determined, still couldn't break free from the past. Every time he mentioned Tasha, every time he faced the memories of her, his heart ached. Kira remained silent, her eyes wet but without tears. David understood that she had endured too much hurt, too many disappointments in her life to express her emotions freely. She didn't allow herself to be vulnerable, to break down. But here, in front of her mother's grave, in front of the name Tasha, perhaps for the first time, Kira allowed herself to feel the pain she had kept hidden for so long. Kira straightened up, took a step back, and turned to look at David. "My mother always talked about you," she said, her voice uncertain but clear. "She said you were the only one she trusted." Those words hit David like a shockwave. It felt as if Tasha was still somewhere, still watching him, still in his heart. He could feel her presence, as if she were standing right there, looking at him and Kira, the two people she had loved with all her heart, but now had to face the separation she could not prevent. David couldn't say anything more. He just bowed his head in silence. The emotions inside him surged. Memories of Tasha revived in his mind. Tasha had once told him that she didn't want to be a burden to him, that she would never stand in his way, even though she knew that in his heart, she would always be an irreplaceable part of him. And now, standing before Tasha's name on this gravestone. David felt he had left her behind for too long. But everything had changed now. Kira was his daughter, and he would never allow her to endure the loneliness Tasha had suffered. Kira said nothing more. She placed her hand gently on David's shoulder, a simple gesture, but full of trust. At that moment, they both stood silently in the rain, no words spoken. They didn't need to say anything, only the sound of the rain falling, the sighs in the quiet space, and the memories buried forever beneath the cold earth. Kira was not the small child that David once thought. She was stronger, more resilient, and most importantly, she had begun to believe in love. Love wasn't something that could be easily given, but that love, though delayed, would be an essential part of their lives. And in this moment, David knew their relationship would change. Not from sadness or hurt, but from acceptance, understanding, and most importantly, from a trust that had been rebuilt. Spring arrived late, and the street where David lived gradually became covered in the green of budding trees. But for him, spring was not just a change in the weather. It symbolized a transformation in life, a life he never imagined having. But now, it was the one thing he needed the most. Along with Kira, he was no longer the stoic judge, the man of work and logic, but a father, a man who knew how to love and care for a daughter he had never known for 12 years. This wasn't a simple change. It was a revolution in his heart, a turning point no one could have predicted. That weekend, the weather warmed unexpectedly, and the atmosphere inside David's house felt different. The house, usually quiet and at times cold, was now filled with laughter, hurried footsteps, and small fragments of life. Kira had started to take part in household chores, from tidying up the living room to rearranging books on the shelves, things she would have avoided before. Each time she passed through the room, David felt the change. A warmth crept into his heart, as though the house was no longer just lonely but alive, filled with emotion, and a bond between two people. A new family was beginning to take shape. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the window, David walked into the kitchen and found Kira cooking breakfast. She was no longer sitting quietly or merely observing him work. She stood at the stove, her small hands carefully cracking eggs into a bowl, adding a pinch of seasoning, as though she were preparing something very important. The bustling atmosphere in the kitchen, the soft clink of pots and pans, was all very different from before. The kitchen, once a place where David was alone, now seemed to glow with the presence of Kira. David stood in the doorway, his gaze fixed on the girl, focusing on her task. A strange feeling surged in his chest, pride, gratitude, and a hint of anxiety. He had thought he would remain alone forever, once believing his career and justice would be all he needed. But now, looking at the girl before him, a part of him realized that family was the reason he woke up every morning, the reason to love and to be connected. Kira looked up, her eyes sparkling as she smiled at him, a smile David never thought he'd see. She said, her voice gentle but slightly shy, "I made breakfast today, Dad. Could you help me?" David walked into the kitchen without saying anything, simply taking off his coat and sitting down at the table. He watched Kira work, feeling a joy he had never experienced before. In the past, he had lived in solitude, thinking he didn't need anyone, that his career and justice would be enough. But now, seeing the girl before him, he realized that family was the reason to wake up, the reason to love and connect. That breakfast wasn't perfect. The eggs were slightly overcooked, but it was the first meal Kira had made for David. And though it wasn't perfect, it was a perfect moment for them. They sat together in the kitchen, eating the eggs Kira made, talking about the small things in their day. These simple conversations were things they had never had before. David looked at Kira, his heart lightened. "You know," he said, Your mom loved you very much. And even though she's not here, you can still feel that love. I promise I'll do everything I can to protect you, to make sure you always feel safe and happy." Kira sat silently, looking at her plate, but then she lifted her head and looked straight into David's eyes. "I know," she said. "I feel something different now, but sometimes I still don't know what to do." Her voice was choked, as though she was trying to say something she couldn't fully express. David smiled, gently placing his hand on hers. "It's okay, Kira. We'll get through this together. Family isn't something you can build in a day, but we'll make it strong, little by little." Though there was no clear answer or immediate turning point, in that moment, David knew they had begun a new chapter of their lives, a chapter they would continue to write together. Things wouldn't be easy, and there would likely be tough times ahead, but these small steps would be the solid foundation for building a new family. The next day, David took Kira to a park near their home, where children were playing in the fresh air. Kira rarely interacted with others, but today, she seemed to be opening up more. She smiled as she watched the kids play soccer, and David could feel that the walls around her heart were slowly coming down. Though it was a small step, it was a significant one, a sign of change. Kira began to engage with her surroundings, no longer retreating into her shell of loneliness. She joined in on the sports activities, chatted with new friends, and gradually started to feel that life could be something beautiful. The pain of the past couldn't be erased overnight, but with David by her side, Kira began to feel that she didn't have to face it alone anymore. That evening, when they returned home, David found Kira sitting on the couch, engrossed in a book. He sat down next to her, saying nothing, just gently placing his hand on her shoulder. Kira looked up at him, her gaze no longer filled with doubt, no longer full of wounds. She had started to trust him, to believe that this was the family she had been waiting for all these years. "Dad, I want to talk to you," Kira said after a long silence. "Thank you for everything you've done for me. Even though I don't know if I can call you Dad right now, I know one thing. I want to be here. I want us to be a family." David felt a wave of emotion rising in his chest. He didn't need Kira to call him Dad immediately. He just needed to know that she was ready for a new life. A life not only full of pain and loss, but also love and acceptance. They sat there together, in the home that was no longer a place of solitude, but a real home. A new family was slowly being built from the fragments of the past. Neither of them knew what the future would hold, but at least they had each other, and that was the most important thing. David smiled, gripping Kira's hand. "We'll build everything together, Kira. From now on, nothing is impossible. We'll create the family that both you and I deserve." It was a new family, beginning with small steps, with simple moments full of meaning. And no matter what challenges life would bring, David and Kira knew they would never face them alone again. They had each other. This spring was unlike any David Carter had ever experienced. It didn't just mark the change in nature, but also a profound shift in the lives of him and Kira. A year had passed since Kira first entered his home, and although those months hadn't always been easy, David could feel that they had a family now, and that family was slowly building a bright future. Kira was no longer the quiet girl sitting in the corner. She no longer lived in the solitude of her own world, keeping secrets only she knew. Her steps had become more confident, her smile more frequent. These were signs of change, signs that she was learning to trust life, herself, and the people around her. Although there were still times when Kira had doubts, still nights when she wanted to hold on to her sadness, these small changes, these baby steps, were proof of a different future she could look forward to. David looked at Kira every day and felt that she was gradually becoming a part of his life. Every morning, Kira woke up with him, prepared breakfast, and no longer sat in silence alone. They talked about the little things in their day, things that seemed insignificant but were crucial in building a lasting relationship. Their conversations were no longer short and careful. They were full, containing joy, sharing, and dreams. David could feel that Kira no longer saw him as an outsider. She had started to see him as a part of her life, as a father she could trust. On weekends, they went to the park together, a new habit they had formed. The lush green surroundings and the joyful children running around created a space of comfort and happiness. Kira often participated in basketball games, talking with new friends she had made. David sat on the bench, his eyes always on her, but he no longer felt anxious. This time, he could relax, watching Kira laugh and play without worrying about the uncertainties of the future. Her future had already begun to take shape, and no matter how many challenges lay ahead, he knew they would face them together. Kira had started dreaming about her future, about what she could do when she grew up. She shared with David that she wanted to study architecture, to create great buildings where people could live and feel safe and happy. Her words moved David. He remembered his own youth, his own dreams and hopes for the future, which life had slowly made him forget. But now, seeing Kira, he felt a rekindling within himself. Once again, he felt that he could dream, that he could build a future for himself and for her. They began making plans for the future. David helped Kira choose schools, explore scholarship opportunities, and always encouraged her to pursue her passion. He knew that studying architecture would be no easy feat, but he never told her to give up. He believed that with persistence and passion, Kira would succeed. He hadn't had the chance to build a family when he was younger, but now he had the opportunity to right the wrongs of the past and watch Kira's dreams come true. Every evening, when they sat together on the sofa, drinking tea and talking, David saw the change in Kira's eyes. She was no longer a shy child. She was growing, learning how to face the world. David looked at her, proud and happy, feeling the perseverance in every step Kira took, and he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would always be together. Their life wasn't perfect, but it was real, full of opportunities and hope. Since Kira came into his life, David not only learned how to be a father, but also how to live again. His life was no longer just work and cold verdicts. It was a life with meaning, with someone to love and care for. Each passing day, he felt more alive, and more importantly, he felt that Kira wasn't just his daughter, but the most important part of his future. One morning, as the sunlight streamed through the window, David and Kira stood together in the yard, looking toward the street. Kira held his hand tightly, saying nothing, but her eyes were filled with confidence and determination. David looked at her, then toward the future. He knew that while they couldn't change the past, they could make the future brighter. A future they would build together, where nothing would be impossible if they always stayed by each other's side. With Kira, David didn't just have a family. He had a new reason to keep living, to keep loving, and to keep fighting. Together, they would overcome every difficulty, building a future they never dared to dream of. And as they looked ahead, David's heart was full of faith. Faith in family, in love, and in a bright future where they would always have each other. The story of David and Kira is not only a journey of self-awareness and healing, but also a profound lesson in patience, change, and forgiveness. It reflects not only the unique dynamics of a newly formed father-daughter relationship, but also a journey of self-reconnection, facing the past, and moving forward by overcoming fears and doubts. Their story, filled with pain and loss, carries a powerful message about the strength of love and determination. At the beginning, David was a cold man, living in the world of justice but lacking the warmth of family. His career, with all its achievements and prestige, could not fill the loneliness he felt every night. Despite having everything in his hands, he lacked one crucial thing: family love. His relationship with Tasha, the woman he loved, though beautiful and intense, could not overcome the societal and familial barriers. It was this separation that left a void in his heart, a void he would only begin to recognize later when he met Kira. This story is not only about the reunion of a father and daughter, but also about the reconnection of a man with himself. David was not only trying to understand Kira, but was also learning how to face his own unhealed wounds. His relationship with Kira was not just an opportunity to make up for the time lost with a child he never knew. It was also an opportunity for David to realize that life doesn't always go according to plan, but it can still be beautiful when we open our hearts and accept the things we cannot change. Tasha, the woman David had loved, was a symbol of great love, but one that was never fully realized, a shadow of a past that could never return. In the years after Tasha's departure, David had seemingly poured all his energy into his work, into delivering justice, to forget the sense of absence. But meeting Kira made him realize that he couldn't continue living with the pain of the past. He had to face what had happened in order to fully embrace his life. Kira, though just a young girl, was the most important character in David's journey to finding happiness. The resilience and hidden pain in Kira, masked by a tough exterior, reminded David of the suffering children endure when abandoned. Kira was not only a victim of a broken family system, but also a victim of a lack of love and care. She didn't trust anyone, not knowing she could have a real family until she met David. Her transformation from a hurt child to a strong girl who could open her heart and trust David's love was a miracle that only love and patience could bring. David and Kira's story also reflects a message about change not only in individuals, but in life itself. The wounds of the past are not impossible to heal, but they require time, acceptance, and, most importantly, companionship from others. Kira didn't just change David, she also changed herself. From a cold, distant child, she learned to trust those important in her life. And through that, she began to build a brighter future. The love in this story is not an idealized or perfect love. It is a love built slowly, day by day, through small actions, gestures of care, and moments of sharing. This love helped David and Kira overcome all barriers, allowing them to become a real family. This proves that it is never too late to start over, and that human connections can overcome any difficulty if we truly try and open our hearts. Moreover, the story of David and Kira sends a message about the importance of family. Family is not just what we are born into, it is what we build. Family can be those not of our blood, but those we love and care for. Relationships do not always need to be perfect, but love, care, and patience will help us overcome any challenges and difficulties. Family is where we can find comfort, protection, and where everyone is always ready to stand by each other, no matter what. Looking back, David understands that becoming a father is not an easy responsibility, but it is a precious gift. The truth is, he missed out on many years of Kira's life, but now he will do everything he can to make up for the lost time. The most important thing is that he knows on this journey he is not alone. With Kira, with love, and with the determination to rebuild a family from the broken pieces, he can face anything. Finally, their story is not just the story of a father and daughter, but the story of healing, belief in the future, and the awareness that every step in life matters. No matter what the future holds, David and Kira have found peace and happiness in the simplest of things, and that is the deepest meaning of their story.